Hello and welcome everyone, students, faculty, and staff. My name is Mai Burrell, and I'm currently a sophomore here at the Elliott School studying International Affairs and Economics, and I'm also the co-president for Young Black Professionals in International Affairs. Thank you to everyone for attending our event this evening on the intersection of race in international affairs theory and foreign policy. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, each of which have created the foundation for us to hold this event tonight. We're starting with the Black Heritage Celebration, the Elliott School of International Affairs, the GW Black Alumni Association, the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative, and the ESIA Department of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs. A few housekeeping items before we start our event this evening. We ask that you please keep all your microphones off for the duration of the event. We will have a section dedicated to panelists' Q&A questions from the audience, and we ask that you direct your questions towards Simeon Parker in the chat function, as he will be leading that part of our event tonight. So to get started, the three core international affairs theories are realism, constructivism, and liberalism, and they serve as the dominant framework that have shaped our understanding of and knowledge of foreign policy. However, such theoretical models are rooted in deep racial biases that create binaries of underdeveloped, developed, modern, and primitive nations that is used to justify imperialism and colonization. And this perpetuates diplomacy that not only centers, but also epitomizes the West and the Western Hemisphere. Such systems serve as the basis for the United States foreign policy and perpetuates a state of world affairs that is completely blind to racism. The purpose of this event is to examine the intersection of race and the founding principles of these theories of international relations and foreign policy, and how they inform our knowledge of international legitimacy, cooperation, development, and power. This event collaborates with the GW Black Student Union for the annual Black Heritage Celebration, which commemorates Black History Month. Thus, we have invited panelists to speak today on their own individual experiences, but also their scholarship, as well as their solutions that they have supported in their respective fields and roles in order to navigate and identify the intersections of race and international relations. The goal to better prepare the next generation of global leaders. Today's event will be moderated by Hannah Jackson, who is currently a sophomore here at the George Washington University within our Elliott School of International Affairs. She's currently majoring in international affairs with a concentration in international development in Africa. Hannah is the current president, but she's also the founder of Young Black Professionals in International Affairs. Anna is currently a research intern for the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. She's a student research intern for the Institute of African Studies in the Elliott School of International Affairs. And most recently, Hannah presented extensive research on the neoliberal approaches to development in Senegal at the GW 2020 Spring University Writing and Research Conference. Without further ado, it is now my pleasure to welcome Hannah and turn the floor over to her.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Maya, for your introduction. I am incredibly excited to be here tonight and moderating this very pertinent and important conversation. I would now like to introduce our amazing panelists. Mr. Travis L. Atkins is a lecturer of African and Security Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. As an international development leader, he has 2 decades of experience working in governance, civil society, and refugee and migration affairs in over 50 nations throughout Africa and the Middle East. This includes serving as staff director of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, working with leading international non-governmental organizations and think tanks, as well as within several branches of the UN system. Travis is an alumnus of the International Affairs Fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations and a recipient of academic appointments from Carnegie Mellon and New York universities. Mr. Atkins has served in numerous international election observation missions in Africa and the Middle East with the National Democratic Institute, and is a contributor to Foreign Policy, the Griot, the BBC, and Al Jazeera on African affairs. He is the creator and host of the On Africa podcast, which engages diverse thought leaders in conversation on the continent's politics, history, and culture. Dr. Yolande Buka is an assistant professor with the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. She is a scholar practitioner of peace and conflict whose research and teaching focus on state-society relations, political violence, gender, and field research ethics in sub-Saharan Africa. She holds a PhD in international relations from American University. Her current research is a multi-sided historical and political analysis of female combatants in Southern Africa. She is also a co-investigator on a project exploring the microdynamics of political protests in Africa. Her research has received support from the Fulbright Scholar Program, the American Association of University Women, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Before joining Queen's University, she was a visiting professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Denver. Her current research is a multi-sided historical and political analysis of female combatants in Southern Africa, and she has also worked with and offers support to USAID, the UK Department of International Development, the United Nations, the African Union, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the United States Institute of Peace. Professor Siba N. Grovegui is a professor of international affairs theory, law, and political thought at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. His work offers a long-standing focus on non-Western perspectives on disorder in states and governments' relationships. In publications such as Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy, Members of International Order and Institutions, he examines the changing traditional stakeholders in international relations. His research interests include political theory, transnationalism, and diaspora. Born in Guinea, Professor Grovegui obtained his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and until 2014 held a professorship at Johns Hopkins University. Last but not least, Professor Vanessa Wills is an assistant professor of philosophy at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She was recently the German Academic Exchange Service visiting chair in ethics and practice at the Munich Center for Ethics. Her areas of specialization are moral, social, political philosophy, 19th century German philosophy, especially Karl Marx, and race. Wills is on the editorial board of Spectre Journal, a biannual journal of Marxist theory, strategy, and analysis. Her publications include Bad Guys and Dirty Hands, Ethical Policing in the Face of Racial Injustice, What Are You Doing Around Here? Trayvon Martin and the Logic of Black Guilt, and Martin, Historical Contexts and Contemporary Manifestations of Racial Dynamics. Again, I'd like to thank each of our attendees and panelists for being here tonight. And in the interest of time, I want to jump right into the questions we have for this evening, if that's okay with our panelists. And so I want to begin by asking a fairly broad question for both Professor Buka and Professor Grovegui. And that is, how has international affairs theory informed how we understand and study history? That is both the history of the field itself and the historical legacies of processes such as colonialism.
I defer. I'll let you go first.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think I'll answer briefly by kind of explaining how I teach international relations to my students, and then particularly those who are interested in going into international affairs. The first thing that any student generally in North America will do when they study international relations is they'll go into a class and they will be introduced to the first three theories that you introduced us to today in the introduction. And from there are going to be a couple of assumptions about the objectivity of these theories, the history in which these theories are grounded that are often unchallenged and normalized as we understand them. And then they'll move on to other theories. And then if they're lucky, they'll be exposed to post-colonial theories, feminist theories, and other types of critical theories. But by the time they get there, they already have a clear sense. The intellectual point of departure have already situated them in a world where Eurocentrism and history as the West has written it dictates their view and understanding of the world. So I think to round up this answer, I think the intellectual point of departure of how we teach international relations informs how students then understand the world in which they live. And these intellectual points of departures are formed in a way to make us believe that the history of international relation as we know it or as we're being taught is actually an objective history. It's a history that is a common understanding regardless of where we come from and regardless of what type of intellectual orientation we have. When the reality is it's not. When we consider, for instance, Morgenthau's priorities when he was developing his theories, right? So it's somebody who was coming from a deep understanding of what the Holocaust had done to people close to him. His main preoccupation was the prevention of something like the Holocaust happening again. And yet when we introduce the ways in which he introduces his approach to international relations, war and peace, and his understanding of the world order, we assume that it's a rational, objective approach to that particular theoretical leaning. And there is somehow, and if you read some of the history of international relations, you see the kind of this symbiotic relationship between the theory and the way it's taught, the way it's been written, and the way it's been imagined. Because I think we have to also understand that it's an imagined way of understanding the discipline. And those who benefited from it, people who were in departments and in the United States, in the West, and in general. So there's a symbiotic relationship between how the discipline evolved and who used that discipline and for what purposes. And these purposes broadly were empire, were maintaining colonial relationships between the West and the rest. So I think when I teach international relations, that's what I want my students to understand is that this is not chemistry, right? We're not coming in from a position of normalized objectivity without a deep, deep history that is linking the early scholars of international relations and power.
Professor Govigi?
Yes, I thank you for, may I call you Yulan? To Yulan. I'm not going to repeat what she said, but I want to say that we should all remember that international relations and the international and all that the suffixes that come after it, international relations, international politics, international theory, international law, that they all come out of race studies. That is actually established now as a fact. They all come out of race studies, right? And so that's in its epistemology, and I'm sorry I'm going to use that, but the way people look at the world, it comes from race. And its function was to manage two things, not only empires, individual empires, but the relationship between imperial powers. That's how they all started, right? And so when we look at international relations today, the question is whether we have actually gone beyond its primary function, right? Whether, when we think about all of things that the international relations theorists tell themselves, whether it's about war, right? What is just war? What kind of wars are just? What kind of just wars are prohibited, and etc. When we think about development, right? How we think about what stages people are, what we mean by traditional societies. All of those concepts actually come fundamentally from the original race studies, right? And so that has an impact. It has multiple impacts. One, it impacts foreign policy. And since we are sitting in America, I could use some examples later, but it actually does affect foreign policy. And two, it affects what we can study and what we cannot study. For instance, people who have studied international relations, the history of international relations in America is coming from race studies, talk about, for instance, how the Howard School, which is Howard University, there in Washington, the Howard School of International Relations, which actually took a different track from Morgenthau, who was cited earlier, was completely sidelined, right? We don't even know who the major figures are in the Howard School of International Relations, because that original imprint of race meant what concerns us, it shaped what concerns us, who speaks about it, and how we speak about it. All right, and I stop there for now.
Thank you both. And I think that provides a really good segue into our next question for Professor Wills, Professor Govugi again, and any of the other panelists who'd like to answer. And that is, what is missing from our analytical frameworks that turn a blind eye to race, essentially centralizing the West and provincializing the rest, that ultimately results in us not seriously considering African and Latin America, even Middle Eastern nations as independent political and historical actors in both our international, in both the field of international affairs and diplomacy, instead of political and historical subjects. Yeah.
So being a philosopher, I'm gladdened that I am not actually the first panelist to use the word epistemology. I feel very much at home. So I teach social and political philosophy, and I teach ethics, and in that work, you know, we read a lot of classical social contractarian figures, right? People like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, right? All of these kinds of oldies but questionably goodies, right? Kind of figures. And I, you know, in my education, when I was a college student, the way that we were taught these figures was to sort of, let's take what's good out of these figures. Yes, they said lots of problematic things at times, but actually that's just inessential to the theory, right? And we just help them out by imputing to them the view that they would have if they lived in more enlightened times. And, you know, and what I've learned over the years, you know, whether it's through my own research, my own teaching, or, you know, being fortunate enough to learn from other scholars who have done this work, is that it's really impossible to completely sort of prize apart their race theories, right, from their political theories. And so, you know, when my first thought in response to this question, well, what's missing from our analytical frameworks that turns a blind eye to race? My first thought was, well, race, you know, race is the thing that's missing, but it's more pernicious than that, where actually race is often not missing, right? Oftentimes, you know, figures, especially, you know, the ones that do play more of a role in international theory, people like Kant, you know, were some version of Kantian liberal, you know, ideals and values, animates pretty much anything that you're going to try to get done in the UN or any, you know, kind of international body. Where these ideas, you know, animate so much of our understanding about what is just and what is moral, but they're oftentimes based in part on a very specific conception of what people are, you know, if they're even considered people, on what these human-like beings, right, outside of Europe are like. And oftentimes they are, you know, imputed, people of color around the world are thought of as being less rational, childlike, standing outside of history, right, not actually being capable of acting in the world or in humanity in the way that people of European descent are. And this is oftentimes really baked into some of these core theories, right, that animate a lot of our work. You know, and I'll just add briefly that, you know, I'm reminded of years ago, being at an event. This was in Germany, and there were German politicians talking about the role of Germany in the world and the role that Germany was going to play in basically like shaping global foreign policy in Asia. And I walked up, I was the only Black person there. And it was interesting because as soon as I walked up to the mic, the people on the stage like shuffle, like, what is she gonna say, right? And I just asked a simple question. And I said, you know, who in this region has asked you to come? Who are you working with in the region who has asked you to come, who has asked you to be there? And the second question is, what is the model of European intervention in these areas that you look to as something that you would like to repeat now, right? And I got a lot of bluster, you know, no answer, obviously, you know, but just the very idea that people who are affected by a policy might be considered stakeholders in the policy making, that itself is often an extremely radical thought, you know, that in these spaces. And that's, you know, so I think the question in a way answers itself, right? What's missing is precisely that, a recognition of marginalized peoples as people who have the ability to intervene in their own lives and direct their own futures.
Am I next? Or who is next?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yes, I actually just wanted to make 2 points since I'm following philosophy. The social sciences, as they set to know the world, are really the brainchild of a man called Francis Bacon. And Bacon's ideas are the ones that gave us the British Academy of Science, the French Academy of Science, and later Bacon's idea is what propelled everybody in the New World and etc. And I'm saying this for 2 reasons. One, because Bacon was really explicit that the social sciences, and you can, and so you can, if you look, and I'm going to say this, I know many of you are freshmen and junior, etc., but it's about time we actually introduce these ideas. That you can see, for instance, the social sciences and the humanities before the 17th century, they are all centered and predicated on the unity of the species. Philosophy, mathematics, geometry, you can go along. The sciences of the 17th century all were based on the idea of difference of a particular kind, right? And so it's not philosophy and etc. anymore. So philosophers, the way philosophers err are not the same way that historians err. And we have to be clear about that, right? So if you look at political science, political economy, psychology, all of the ones that come after the 17th century were actually designed strictly to pertain to the management of empire. So there's actually a very good split. You can just look at them, right? You can even say the years, if you go to dictionary.com to see the years when they were created, they actually come at a particular time in history. So there is a reason why the idea of international law comes about in the 19th century, right, toward the end of the 18th century with Bentham, right? It had to do with making sure that Europeans, when they meet in the colonies, are governed by a set of laws that are not the same as Europeans when they fight one another in Europe, when they, right? Which are also different from, so there were 3 sets of laws. One, laws that apply to Europe within Europe. Second set of laws that apply to Europeans when they are fighting the natives, in which they were not supposed to recruit the natives to their own goals, that they fight the natives together jointly. And thirdly, each one of them individually, what they can do to the natives. That is how international relations was organized, strictly, right? And so the idea that other human beings, right? So you can look the law of discovery, right? If Europeans wander around somewhere else and whatever they find, they take. That was not available to us, right? The idea that Black people, yellow people, I'm using derogatory language because I'm putting them in quotation marks because they're actually derogatory, right? So yellow people, brown people, black people, the idea that they did not have a relationship with their environment that were constitutive of property lasted from the first time Columbus set his foot here until Nasser, during the Suez crisis, basically said, it's our body of water, it's our canal, we take it. And then that led to nationalization that followed afterward, right? Basically, the Suez crisis, and this is the thing, when we're talking about international relations, most people don't think about the value of the Suez, because we read the Suez crisis, that goes to your first premise. We read the Suez crisis in America as a thing of the Cold War, and Nasser being wrong-headed. We don't read it as like a world historical event in which for the first time, people who are not Europeans would say that their environment were theirs. And whatever relations they had to their environment was constitutive of property. Whether they held it, whether they had a deed, whatever they did was theirs. Right? So we miss all of those because we are so focused on realism, whatever, this and that chasing stuff. We don't. And I'm giving to give it the next example. The next example, and I want to give, because I see there are a lot of foreign policy people here, so I'm going to go to one of my favorite characters, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, during the time of apartheid, basically charted the course of US foreign policy towards South Africa. It's called National Security Memorandum 39. National Security Memorandum 39. It's called the Kissinger Study of Southern Africa. And he had these multiple options. The option that he chose as US foreign policy towards Southern Africa was the option that said, the whites are here to stay. And Bill Clinton's national security advisor, Anthony Lake, wrote a critique of that book called the tar baby option, right? Because that idea that the whites are here to stay, Anthony Lake called the tar baby option, because it was basically aligning the US on white supremacy in Southern Africa. Right? But what is lost to all the people who look at realism, you know, the US had to follow its policy, blah, 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 is that in fact what is said, that the whites are here to stay, was said in a particular way, and that Nelson Mandela, in his Rivonia trial, before he went to jail, had also said that the whites were here to stay, but on different terms, right? Because he said he will fight white supremacy, but he will also fight black supremacy. And SADC had also said the whites are here to stay, but on different terms. Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau had also said the whites are here to stay, which means that our ways of understanding the world clash with Henry Kissinger's. So if you just say the world is whatever, blah, 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 and it doesn't actually serve you. But if you say, what does it exactly mean the whites are here to stay? Now, you can look at what Nelson Mandela said. He said, oh, what a magnanimous fellow. He's so nice and kind. But Nelson Mandela is not the only one to say that. In Haiti, after the revolution, they said we are all Haitians. Frederick Douglass here said Chinese were citizens too in his Boston speech, right? Quilombos in Brazil were the first to incorporate, right, to incorporate Native American everybody in the community. So the idea which Cromwell, a Black Baptist here in America, said, framed as no partial public sympathies, that we will not want any right for ourselves that other people do not deserve, is quintessentially in African political philosophy from Quilombo in the 17th century all the way to Nelson Mandela. We cut across centuries and space in the Black diaspora, but goes against everything, all the ways in which white people, and I'm talking here about Europeans, have conceived of how the world should function. Right? So if we fall into realism, blah, 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 we're actually missing how the world actually works. The thing is that realism in particular is a very misanthropic story, but it works because the fictions of state of nature, human nature, and et cetera, allow Europeans to justify everything else, right? National interest, just war, all of those things that follow. And which is why realism, liberalism, constructivism may fit into some explanatory model for foreign policy. As international relations theory, they're actually completely meaningless. And I stop there.
Thank you for that. And I think that segues into our next question for Professor Buka and Professor Atkins, and that is, how is the way that we study and learn international affairs theory affecting our foreign policy, both historically and presently?
Thank you for the question, Hannah, and thank you guys so much for organizing this. It's great that this question is both to myself and Dr. Buka, because I was going to say that I was going to start my comments reading from the first chapter of Professor Buka, specifically in terms of the idea of points of departure. And what I mean by that is when we look at international relations theory, we're essentially looking at a Western enterprise of how to define the world. But that world that is being defined is a world that is post-plunder, post-colonization, post-massacre, right? Post-subjugation of Black and brown people in the world. And it sets out on an enterprise which essentially seeks to ignore those things and move forward a kind of humanistic, liberalized agenda, which in essence makes them the arbiters of that world, those who decide who is credentialed in that world. As someone said earlier, those who decide what questions are worthy of study and which ones are not, an effort which sets human beings under a certain kind of hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, they are actually presenting themselves as the saviors of a world which they have actually destroyed. And so when you look at the nations of Western Europe, who were the drivers of the transatlantic slave trade, you look at those same nations, they are the drivers of the colonial European colonization of Africa. But when you come to the modern era, then those same nations, adding a few to them, are now the international community, which wears a halo and gives foreign assistance and decides who needs what, who deserves what, how power dynamics are structured. And so in the course of that, you also get a trajectory in which says, this is the subjugated world. This is the third world. This is the developing world. This is now, to be polite, the global South, right? But if you look at that as a metaphor and you think about all of the racial and religious connotations that that European conquest took on, what you have in the global North and the global South is really a metaphorical heaven and a metaphorical hell, one above, one below, one that is the envy of the world, one that needs to be saved from itself. And so I think that this whole enterprise, one of the reasons that it ignores those things is because if you include the plundered, you have to say who plundered them. If you include the marginalized, then that leads to a course of study about how they became marginalized. If you include inferiors, you have to ask yourself who decided that they were so. And if you're going to take that course of study, then you cannot be the savior of the world you created, because that course of study leads us to the realization that through processes of history, you are actually the ones who set up the processes and the violence in mass that actually brought those regions of the world into the plundered state that you did, and then said that they needed to be developed and that they didn't have history, right? And they had long history. And for a major part of it over the last century, the Western powers were the ones that set them at odds with where they might have seen themselves going and the course on which they aspired for their nations to undertake themselves.
Thank you, Travis. I think this is, I'm looking at the chat and the response from the truth you're speaking is quite active. I think, I've been recommending to my students to read Silencing the Past by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. one of the there's a few myths in our of origins in our discipline that we seem to hold on to, right? And Silencing the Past talks about power and production of history, how history has been constructed in a particular way to include certain things and to erase others. And what's erased, you know, people from the global south, their accomplishments, their contributions, their political theories, their ontologies, their cosmologies, all these things have been erased. And when they're not erased, they've been deformed in order to be able to demonize them or pathologize them. And I think for me, and this is my, you know, intellectual kind of bone to pick, is what history actually constitutes our discipline. And, you know, when I think, for instance, about the emergence of the nation state in Europe, and the amount of violence, because this is another part of this myth that when we look at African states, for instance, because I teach a lot of IR of Africa, you know, the point of start, and when we think about violence and war in Africa, is the kind of the post-colonial era, and particularly around the Cold War, the beginning and the beginning of the collapse of the Cold War. And we see the emergence of civil wars, and that becomes the only lens through which we understand sub-Saharan Africa. What we don't ever think about is the role that violence played in the emergence of the nation state in Europe. And I'm not simply talking about the wars of religion that have been documented, and then the emergence of the Treaty of Westphalia, which then Siba's written extensively about, this kind of this myth of you know, sovereignty that applies to all across time and across space. I'm talking, for instance, of the massacres of the Vendée in France, right, where religious minorities were systematically eliminated in order to force everybody to fall in line with it within how they defined the nation, right? I'm talking about ethnic cleansing within the European territory around the time that the nation state was trying to emerge out of Europe. The nation state was not a natural, accidental occurrence. The amount of violence that was used to clear complete areas of land, to clear people who diverge or that were not in line with the ways in which power wanted to construct its state, is something that is completely erased from the narrative. So for me, as I'm engaging with students in deconstructing what they think they know about international relations, I often fall back on, how do you know what you know? How have we normalized particular histories? And I think Travis gives a perfect way and a perfect trajectory in terms of understanding, you know, what Du Bois calls as this, you know, this global color line, right? How does the color line get established? How is it put into place? How is there a consensus among a particular group of, not even state per se at that point, but particular heads of empires and kingdoms, on how to better plunder another group of people? And once you are able to find this consensus amongst yourself, then you can easily say, I mean, I'm always thinking, for instance, that Queen Jinga of Angola, right? Where for decades, she resists Portuguese, you know, the Portuguese trying to take over. And the only way in which the Portuguese are eventually able to take over Angola after decades is by collaborating with the Dutch. Because for decades, she's giving them a run for their money. She knows, she's a wonderful military strategist. But from our understanding of military history in sub-Saharan Africa, Europeans arrived, they were militarily superior, and then took over in a flash, when we know, in fact, that it's not the case. The amount of resistance that was there was quite heavy, and sometimes it took decades to be able to take over. And in some cases, it took this consensus among European states, not only to say, this is how we're going to carve out the territory, this is how we're going to ensure that polities in Africa do not get access to weapons. We'll ensure that they don't have access to weapons. And then once we're able to carve out all these spaces, we will destroy what they have created. The looting and destruction that Travis is talking about is the elimination and the erasure of traditions, of religions, our history, of philosophy. And then we'll be able to come and say, we saved them. If you read the Treaty of Berlin, right, if you read between the line, but also black on white paper, the ways in which there's already a gendered and racialized, idea of salvation, of white savior, a white masculinist savior of the populations, then you are able to trace this Berlin document all the way to what happens in Libya a few years ago. How do you rationalize military intervention? By continuously undermining the potential for people's sovereignty, and arguing that if you're not there, everything is going to collapse, right? So you qualify sovereignty, you qualify the integrity of people's agency by erasing a very long history of their own polities, of their own political and social traditions. But Europe also erases the blemishes on its own record to be able to create a history where the nation state emerged naturally in Europe. It did not involve the amount of violence that it did. And how in the world are we not able to see the emergence of nation state naturally in Africa? That must be a pathology. So I think these points are quite problematic. And for me, as I'm teaching international relations to my students, I try to shed light on these portions of history and the ways in which it became complicit to establishing the discipline that we have today. Because if the emergence of the nation state is not a natural occurrence in Europe, why is it set as a normal expectation for every other state around the world?
Wow, thank you to both Dr. Buka and Professor Atkins. We talked a bit about the institutions that define our current world order, but I now want to turn a bit to Professor Wills, and I want to speak to, as an expert in political philosophy, some argue that political systems such as communism, Marxism, and socialism are better forms of equitable governance than democracy. And so I want to ask you, how does political structure support, I guess, racist institutions that currently characterize our world order? Are democratic states more racist than socialist, authoritarian, or Marxist states?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So first of all, I think one thing to disentangle a bit, right, is that I think it's a core piece of kind of liberal capitalist theorizing about the nature of the liberal state to claim the word democracy for itself only, right? And it's interesting, why does that happen? Why is there this association that democracy somehow entails the liberal capitalist state? And it comes from thinking that it is a core piece of democracy that capital be free and relatively inessential, right? Whether people are free, right? So in the early United States, right, when it is a country with slavery, the United States conceives of itself as a free, as the land of the free, of course, right? And as a place where liberty uniquely reigns, even though that liberty and freedom contradictorily includes the liberty to deny freedom from others, right? And to benefit from the labor and the life, right, of other people. So I think that we have a similar, like we can see these things playing out now, especially over the past year, when we look at different kinds of responses to the set of that have been highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, both in the United States and globally. I'm going to talk a bit about the US situation, right? So we had, I mean, back in March, I mean, it's interesting to take a look back at the way that the discourse about COVID-19 has shifted. It's quite defeatist at this point. So at this point, if you are a person who considers yourself sort of on the left in some broad sense, or a progressive of some, you know, then the scope of the struggle about how should the United States government respond to COVID-19 is whether it should now give a single payment of $2,000, or whether we already got a $600 down payment, right? And now should struggle for $1,400, right? So that's a very, like, this is a very tiny, narrow, $600 is the scope, right, of the debate. And I think that makes it hard to think back to the spring, when I think the crisis caused people to think much more expansively. And one of the things that occurred in response to it was the, I think the recognition that whatever our response to COVID-19 was going to look like, it couldn't be a sort of narrow national response, right? That it is inherently international. We're seeing that, right? It's inherently something that, and that is an opportunity that was squandered, right? The opportunity that the U.S. had at that point to work, you know, with China, for example, in a collaborative manner, right? Or to work even with European countries, right, in a collaborative manner, or to look at the example of various African countries and how they responded to COVID-19, and not see it as some sort of very odd and inexplicable, you know, not even a miracle, like just like, you know, like, you know, if you look at like some of the reports at the results that are coming in Africa, it was like they were seeing an animal like write a book or something, you know, it was like this like total like refusal to recognize that this is because people have a scientific understanding and a correct like line about how to respond to this crisis. So the US was totally like unable and unwilling to learn from people in African countries and to collaborate, right, as they should have. So we had this like nationalistic response. But then, you know, within the, you know, in terms of like within the US borders, you had a kind of opposition between voices that wanted a social response to the crisis. People, you know, when the Black Lives Matter protests broke out, those were a linking of a race demand, stop killing Black people, right? Together with a social demand, stop killing Black people and take all the money that y'all spend on killing Black people and use it, right, on these social programs. Use it for education, use it for public health, use it to do what is the single most important public health measure that has not occurred a year into the pandemic, which is to pay people to stay home, which is what other wealthy countries have done. And against that, right, against demands to have proper lockdown and to have the material resources people need for lockdown, we saw this, the so-called lockdown protesters. And what is the banner that they protest under? Well, they say, this is tyranny. We need to be free. We have rights. We have liberty. Isn't this a democracy? And what do they mean by that, right? They mean the democracy of capital, right? They mean that people who own capital should be free to buy and sell, to engage in trade and exchange in an unlimited manner, even if it includes spreading death across the country, right? And so you have this real contradiction between one vision of democracy as a democracy of dollars and another vision of democracy as a democracy of people, right? And a democracy of how is it going to be possible for people to live, right? The most basic, right? The precondition of any other human right, right? So, so that question, it goes, that answer that I just gave, it goes to why I think we have to resist some of the, and this is really kind of like Cold War, like leftover framing, this like that democracy is capitalism. And I want to just end by saying a little bit more about why, where that emerges from, right? And part of it is that the demands, the needs of working people who are disproportionately, right, when we think about who the essential workers are, they are disproportionately people of color, they are disproportionately women and people of marginalized genders generally. And when we think about, their demands and the things that they need, these are things that run up directly against the kind of narrow capitalist freedoms that are championed by lockdown protesters and so on. The demand that businesses be closed is of course contradictory to the freedom of business to just do whatever it wants to, regardless of the impacts. And so it does speak to a kind of inherent inner contradictoriness of liberalism, right? And the limits of liberalism to account for the material needs of people, as long as it subordinates those to these very abstract freedoms of capital.
Thank you. And I think as a follow-up to that, I want to turn to, again, Professor Wills, but also Professor Atkins. How do you think political structures, I guess, influence our views of race? Does one favor or help minorities racially, economically, or in terms of gender more than the other?
I'm Professor Atkins. I'm happy for you to speak first, and I'll follow.
Sure. I was going to say that I don't necessarily think so, but one of the reasons that I say that is when we talk about the kinds of historical processes that have created the world that we live in, they also created a hierarchy that I think permeates all systems of governance, have permeated all economic systems, have permeated religion, right? This idea that the male is superior to the female, that the rich is superior to the poor, that the light or the white is superior to the brown or the dark, that the Christian is superior to the so-called non-Christian. And this is why so many people in the world under a lens like this are not defined by what they are. They are actually defined by what they're not. So then you hear people say non-Western peoples, as if Westernism is the frame, right? Non-Christians, right? Non-white, right? Letting you know that wherever you are, in whichever political system you are under, even the ones that may be seen as countering some of those narratives, you still find, of course, sexism and patriarchy in revolutionary movements that are anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, right? And so it's very difficult, I think, to untangle that kind of hierarchy. And it's one of the reasons when you look at specifically the anti-colonial history on the continent, you find so many examples of people and movements who weren't necessarily trying to overthrow the system of colonialism, but simply wanted to replace and take the seat of European colonialists. And so then they would still have the people in their nation be subjects rather than citizens, right? That the nation would still be in some way a property of a family or an individual, right? And so these systems have permeated in ways that I think makes it very difficult to root them out across the board. But the last thing I would say on that too, though, especially if we're talking about the post-colonial context, specifically in Africa, is that we're talking about a world in which these nations, most of them, have only been independent for 60 to 70 years, right? And here we are in the United States, what, 247 years into our independence, still fighting some of these same struggles, and yet looking at parts of the world who have been able to stand up on their own feet as sovereign nations only for 6 or 7 decades, and judging them with a lens which we certainly weren't judging ourselves under at that same time. And so if you take, 60 years from 1776 is like 1846. Do we really want to talk about women's rights in America in 1846 or 1946 for that matter, right? The status of the indigenous people, 1846, the status of Black people in America, 1846, right? And so we get back to this notion from Dr. Buka about how the world is being framed. And so I will stop there for Dr. Wills to enlighten us a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think in some ways I'm more optimistic, and in some ways equally suspicious. I think, so I have a paper that's called "What Could It Mean to Say Capitalism Causes Sexism and Racism." Because this is it's something that Marxists say, and people say, what do you, that sounds ludicrous, right? And so I wanted to kind of like get into, what does this mean, and why, why would people say it? And one of the things that I think is important to center in, whenever we talk about linking a struggle against a particular type of political or economic system to struggles against various kinds of oppression that are based on identity-based hierarchies, we have to, I think that what is possible is to remove some significant barriers to other work that has to be done. So in other words, I don't think that by switching away from a capitalist system to a socialist one, that we are going to wake up the next day after the revolution and have a world without any racism or sex. I mean, that would be amazing, right? But I think that I don't think that's the way it works. And in fact, Marx actually didn't think it worked that way. And wrote, the opposite thing. And in his critique of the Gotha program, he's talking about different kinds of conceptions of justice, but he argues against people who think that there's going to be this kind of automatic sloughing off of everything that's bad about capitalist society. He says, well, whatever world comes after it is itself going to be a product of this system, right? It's going to be the product, the creation of what's happening now. So therefore, it cannot be something that is completely purged, right, of everything that is bad about our current society. That being said, one of the reasons that I'm a revolutionary, right, is that I think that under capitalism, we are doomed. Right. I think that the idea of doing away with racism or sexism within a system that denies power and that denies political power, that expressly denies the ability of so many people to have a role in making their lives is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen, right? And so, you know, if I weren't a Marxist, I would be the most ardent, like Afro pessimist you ever met, right? You know, but as it happens, you know, I do think that it's possible to create a world that that is genuinely democratic, by which I mean a world where people have control over the resources that are necessary in order to have a just society that where people have access to resources so that they can live, but not just live, flourish, right? Eat, you know, maybe get a degree. I don't know, you know, paint, dance, right? Spend time with their loved ones. All the things that are part of living a really, really good human life, right? I think that's an absolute precondition. And what it can do is create new political conditions within which that work of fighting back against racism and sexism is not a pipe dream. And I'll just add, lastly, that doesn't mean, it crucially does not mean that we can put off the work of combating these different forms of oppression, you know, as some stuff that happens after the revolution. And there are so-called revolutionaries who think that, and they're wrong, right? We won't even make it. We're not going to survive the next couple of years unless we get very serious about combating different forms of identity-based oppressions. Those are part of the struggle for humanity. They can't be dissolved into, we need universal struggle, but you can't just dissolve these different battles into one big undifferentiated amalgam of humanistic struggle. It doesn't work that way, and it won't work that way.
Thank you. Our next question is for Professor Grovegi and Professor Atkins. And I want to turn now from examining very critically from our political structures to our international structures. And so my question is, in what ways has international affairs theory influenced how power is conceptualized by individual countries, leaders, international organizations like the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other international actors? How do these international structures use the frameworks of international affairs theory to legitimize foreign policy decisions that perpetuate the othering of what, Professor Atkins, you term non-Western nations?
Go ahead, brother, please.
I would, that's actually a very broad question, thank you. It's a very broad question, but I just bring it to two concepts, common sense and commonplace, right? International relations theory gives people the sense that they know what they are doing. And somebody introduced to you earlier, it is what is said to have happened as opposed to what actually happens. But it gives us a sense of common sense that we actually know. And the commonplace is what becomes routine, right? So there's what we know, what we think happened, the world is, how the world is, how things ought to be, how things are, and then what takes place routinely. So if you look at the World Bank, the United Nations systems, all of these international organizations, they function that way. Now, the common sense is, since the 17th century, that the West, by dint of reason, science, technology, and morality, have trusteeship over the world, right? And we are all wards of it. So we never question at a level of international institution whether European powers was somebody called international community, right? We say international encompasses all of us, but when we say international community, we think automatically the telephone number is Washington, Paris, London, and we know where they are. But it's not Nairobi, absolutely not, right? So there's this common sense that the West has trusteeship, which it has never relinquished actually. And we find multiple ways in international relations to justify that norm producers, norm whatever, norm devolution, norm this, norm that. It's all meant to actually reinforce that trusteeship, right? And right? And what becomes commonplace is that when we have disputes anywhere, of course the West gets to settle. That's just how it is. Who else will say no, right? It's not even that they have the weapons, that's besides the point. It is that we actually just assume that they are going to settle it, even when they don't know the answer. Which is, somebody mentioned Libya earlier. I wrote an article in Libya about Libya on Foreign Policy magazine, right? It was about that. It was about how the people, Africans who actually had the best solution, were sidelined for people who actually knew nothing about the situation, and actually were going to make it worse, and look at what happened. So I'm not going to repeat the arguments there. But you can just think of it how we produce common sense and how common sense establishes commonplace, what we do, right? And so a friend of mine says, and I'm going to say this, it's a very flippant, it's meant to exaggerate a point, but it's a point nonetheless. At the end of World War II, the country that was left with the money, the weapons, and the know-how to fix the world was the country that knew the least about the world, and he meant America, right? But really, it was the larger point there is not about America. It's really about how the West insists on fixing everything, while at the same time, oftentimes being its leaders, its politicians being the ones that know the least about the world. And that's a frightening place to be, actually, because the weapons of war and etc. are too deadly to live in the hands of people who actually don't know about the world. Right? Look at just what happened in the capital, US capital recently, and you'll know how much we know about the world and how democracy works and etc. Right? So that's what I will say. And the other one, obviously, is among, and I'm just going to say about commonplaces, routine things we do, is that it's not even that they judge, but sometimes at the United Nations, for instance, we set rules and guidelines about what you do if you had, basic moral questions like conflict of interest, right? So I'll give you one quick example and I'll move on. In 1952, they had a crisis in a place called offside Albania, right? It's called the Strait of Corfu. And so the thing goes to the United Nations, and Great Britain was implicated in the conflict. And United Nations said, okay, these 5 countries have a lot of power, so we have to make sure that when they have a conflict of interest, they let other people judge, because otherwise it gets confusing, right? Because sometimes they want to appear that what they are doing is rational and whatever, so we do things the right way, we have traditions, and we know how to adjudicate, and etc. So now, this may be a conflict, it's a muddy point, but basically the rules of procedure of the Security Council says that since these 5 countries are permanent powers, if one of them were implicated in a conflict, then they may only intervene in discussion if the matter is substantive, which means question of justice and etc. But if it's procedural, since process has to do with how to settle the conflict, then they may not intervene, because otherwise, the world will not see, right? And the idea there is that justice has to be seen to be done. Justice has to be seen to be done, right? So the procedural matters, you actually have to be careful that countries, if Great Britain was part of this conflict, then they should not intervene. And Great Britain decided, no, they are going to intervene, but they didn't say it that way. The British are very clever, as George Bernard Shaw said. The British are not as stupid as to let morality stand in the way of their interest. So they gave us a very clever answer. The clever answer was that the question as to whether a matter is procedural or substantive, whether a matter is procedural or substantive, is in itself a substantive question. So they get to talk. That's how they invented the double veto, which means that if things go against them, the US, France, Britain, Russia, and China, they get to veto the matter even before it comes up for discussion, right? So even sometimes when you say, okay, you are too big, you want the power, we give it to you, but please could you at least play by these simple guidelines? They don't do it because they can do it and get away with it, right? But we have to accept it as common sense. Of course, they have to do that. That's otherwise who will do it, and etc. So it gets muddy, but all I'm saying is that you should just remember 2 things. The common sense is that the West has trusteeship, over the world, which is why they have extraterritoriality. They can make laws for the rest of us. They can set the International Criminal Court for the rest of us. They can make rules that apply to the rest of us, but that never apply to themselves, right? Because they actually know how things go. They have the science, the knowledge, moral systems, they know that. And so that's all for the rest of us. And the commonplace, of course, is that they actually don't even live by those guidelines. And so the rest of us gets set holding the bucket. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Doctor. You know, I usually teach this kind of subject matter rooted in a poem that many of you will know. It's called The White Man's Burden. It's by Rudyard Kipling. And I would just start real quick with the first stanza of that in terms of a response to this question. He says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, to serve your go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." And for me, that is really the root of the ideology behind the Western engagement with the so-called rest of the world. And in that poem, and there's another British colonial little poem that they used to say, and it was about this notion that Dr. Buka mentioned earlier about military advancement. And they had what was called at that time the Maxim gun, which was the forerunner to the machine gun. And that poem very quickly said, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not, right? And so when you look at the modern world in terms of both foreign policy, in terms of security and national security, but also in terms of development, there is embedded in both of those this idea, as Dr. Grogovy was saying, that the West knows the way, right? And so this root of war and religion and civilization and who knows the way is part of all of that. And you know, when we look at international development specifically, I mean, imagine a nation that came into being the way that the United States did, suggesting that we know how nations under plunder for centuries should come out of that, right? And the suggestion that if we just have enough MPHs and technical expertise, and if we can just get enough people to start washing their hands and sleeping under mosquito nets, that somehow they will have a modern, thriving, capitalist economy that is a Jeffersonian democracy, right? And when you think of it in those terms, it's actually absurd. And going further, the thing that I want my students to understand is that though at this point in history, we may see ourselves involved in an altruistic endeavor, the history of that, the thinking and the underpinning of that, and even the very language of that is still with us today. And so one of the things that you will hear if you're working, let's say in the United Nations context, first of all, people saying, I'm going to the field. Well, wait a minute. For somebody else, that's home, right? That's their country, that's their nation, that's their vision, village. But for you, it's some field out there in the netherworld. But also you hear people say things like, I'm going on mission, right? Where did that come from? Who goes on mission? Missionaries who are being sent to bring light into the darkness, to bring civilization to backwards and primitive people. If you listen to people in USA and other places, they say, well, I'm going on a TDY. What does that stand for? A tour of duty. Are you going to a war, or are you going somewhere to do something positive in partnership with people, to Dr. Wills' point, who have invited you as a partner into their nation to support them? And so I think in having those kinds of conversations, it at least causes us to stop and reflect on what we're actually doing, what is the history of that practice and endeavor, and how might we begin to change how we think about that. And actually Dr. Buka and I were having a discussion around that earlier this week, around this moment of protest that Dr. Wills was mentioning earlier as it related to Black Lives Matter and the domestic situation in the US, and how that, in tandem with the voices of African scholars and African advocates and activists, created space for us to have conversations like this, but then to ask ourselves the question, what is going on in the Western context that you needed to watch somebody being murdered on a video for 8 minutes and 46 seconds for you to stop and say, hey, wait a minute, our board is not diverse enough. Or maybe we should start having a pipeline from students from Howard to come to work at Save the Children or CARE or wherever else, right? And that makes you think of the suffering that people who have been deemed less than have to go through for these brief moments of enlightenment to perk up in the West, and they can lead to these kind of flowery statements, and even if they're sincere. But the question that we're asking, I think many of us, is about what is the action that's going to come behind that to demonstrate an actual change.
Can I sneak in here just quickly? Because I just want to, there has, somebody said in the chat, there's been so much brilliance, and I'm very humbled to be on this panel. There's been so many amazing reflections, and I just want to add to this that, I think one of the things that is also important to note about Black Lives Matter in the United States and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter protest last summer is the spark that it lit, not only in the U.S., not only among Black people in the U.S. and among many whites in the U.S. who were in solidarity with that movement, but internationally, and of the way that it has inspired Black people around the world to point out the racism and the legacy, I hate to even say legacy, but the legacy of colonialism, plus the active ongoing colonialism, right, that people live under around the world. In France, there's great hand-wringing among sort of like, white liberal elites in France. Well, this horrible American invention of critical race theory and Black Lives Matter. And, you see these, you see protests happening in Germany, in Portugal as well, right? Black Lives Matter protests. And so I want to say something specifically about, internationalism and Blackness and the specific potential that Black activism has to be an international rallying cry. And that happened in the civil rights movement. It happened when we talk about the linkages between activists here in the US and anti-colonialist struggles happening around the world. And we're seeing glimmers of that now, that people in power find very threatening and destabilizing, and they don't like it, right? So when we talk about the sort of right-wing reaction against critical race theory and so on in the United States, that's mirrored internationally, and it's worth looking at why that is and what it actually highlights about the really radical revolutionary potential to draw these kinds of links and have an internationalism that is based not what on heads of state choose to do, but what is based on what people in the streets are doing and how they are creating links with people who are on the streets in countries around the world. And because that's the internationalism that I care about and that I think has real potential to change the world.
May I just 1 minute, no more than 1 minute, please, to what you just said, please.
Yes.
All right, please. I think one of the connections there obviously is that Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd thing has actually given us authorization to use certain languages vis-a-vis America, which we didn't use to, which of course has a very revolutionary potential, which is to say that America actually in some fundamental way is a failed state. And if it's a failed state, then the people who are subject to its failure have to be protected, and we all have to get into the fight against racism. It's a failed state. A failed state doesn't simply mean that the state doesn't have the means to support people. It is when the social compact upon which the country is built has failed consistently a category of people, right? And now in Kenya, in Guinea, everywhere, we actually refer to that dimension of the US as a failed state, and in the manner in which we ourselves are failed states in some ways in Africa, and around the question of race, and that we have to actually look at race and how modern political arrangements have failed Black people everywhere, right? I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Gwobegui. I have about 15 follow-up questions in my notes here. This conversation, even as a moderator, has been both inspiring and enlightening. Perhaps we'll have to do a part 2, but I think that is a lovely place for us to end as we near 7:30. I want to thank each of our panelists for such a robust discussion. And for the last 5 or so minutes, I am going to turn it over really quickly to our Vice President Simeon Parker to moderate a Q&A for any questions our attendees may have.
And we promise we'll try to keep our answers snappy.
All right, well, thanks so much for you guys for participating in this panel and for sharing your time with us this evening, and to our participants for their engagement. So first, we're going to get into some of the questions that were sent via chat. And then a little later, we're going to open it up to the floor for people who want to verbally pose some of the questions in case something just pops into your mind throughout the course of this conversation. So first up, we have, what can professors include in their syllabi to teach critical understandings about the limitations of international relations theory? What materials are there that should be included in a basic education about IA that would allow students to learn about the history and current nature of the field in a more comprehensive manner?
I can quickly answer that in maybe a different way that is expected. And it goes back to the point that I made about intellectual points of departure. I've taught at GW briefly a little while ago, and one of the things that I think is primordial early on in international relations or international affairs pedagogy is really starting from the point where we're interrogating epistemologies and ontologies. Really starting, what is the world that we're exploring, and then how we know, what are the tools that are being used. And when I start like this with my students, I'm giving you an example. I'm teaching a course on politics of war in sub-Saharan Africa. And the first 4 weeks of the class is about deconstructing what people have spent their time learning either in undergraduate or in high school, and not necessarily spoon feed them knowledge, but teach them to be critical thinkers. My students rarely have the opportunity to do that beyond or after my class in the way that I teach it. So my job is not necessarily to feed them information, but to learn to be critical about what they learn. And if you scaffold this type of exercise pedagogically, what you're gifting your students is an opportunity to be more critical once they come across information that sounds like it's been naturalized. And what I mean by naturalized, and this comes from feminist scholarship, because in addition to do critical race research, I also do feminist scholarship, is having the type of curiosity that pushes you to interrogate what is considered normal, what is considered the norm, what is accepted, what is common knowledge and common sense, as the way Sila was talking about. Yeah. Once you start being able to recognize these points that are taken for granted, anything that you add after that allows the students to take it or leave it. So it's not so much the elements, because there's a lot of conversation about, of course, diversifying our syllabi. But even if you have people of color and Black and Indigenous people who, take the same intellectual leaning that the other Western thinkers, you're not necessarily challenging hegemonic thinking about international relations. So what you want to build within the students is the ability to think critically about what they receive. And I think this is the first step, and to do it as early as possible. When I get 4th year students, they ask me, why didn't I see this before? When was I introduced to these things before? And I think pedagogically, this is what we have to think about.
Thank you. Up next, first, I have to mention it is nearing the end of the event. So we understand folks have to sign off, and our secretary, Ellie, has dropped some links to the YBPIA materials, including our website, our Linktree, and some of our social media sites for you guys to reference later. This event will be there, and also our future programming will also be there. So, Hannah, should we get one more question?
We can.
Okay, one more question for those folks who are still on here. This one is about, I guess, some of your experience engaging with the ideas that are brought up today. So the question is, how does your research engage with the issues that we've been discussing today? And what is your process for designing meaningful academic inquiries?
Just in 1 minute, I want to just say quickly that for me, knowledge of the world is built on common sense, I already said, but it has theory, archives, canons, and etc. And that was what Yolande was talking about when with the notion of places where you begin. I think we actually have to build our own archives, our own common sense, our own canons, and etc. Not simply because we want to replace the ones that are there, but because we have a lot of imaginaries of how the world works to recuperate so that they can be there when we are discussing our future, right? For instance, I'm writing a book now because nobody should ever be allowed again to talk about the beginning of the modern state system that doesn't start at Palmares in Brazil. Palmares in Brazil was the first modern state system, the first Republican state system. And I'm actually writing a short paper about it. Anybody on this here who want to send me your email, I'll send it to you in 2 days' time. And it's not just to say Black people did this. It is simply to say that there were other ways of imagining how the world works. And we have to build that. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll speak to this. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a philosopher. And so, I think my work relates to this in ways that, that increasingly other philosophers do, but that historically, especially in the kind of the way philosophy has been done in the United States and in the UK, in English-speaking contexts in particular, has really seen itself as abstracting from the world, right, and being a discipline that is in the realm of kind of pure concepts and ideas. And and something that I think comes out of our conversation today is that there is no such thing, right? These ideas, this is something that Dr. Grovagui pointed out early on in our session today, that these ideas come out of these very specific historical contexts in order to serve particular historical purposes, and there's no conceptual analysis without understanding the history of these concepts that are under analysis. So that's how my work, one of the ways that my work connects with the things that we're doing here. In terms of how do I determine what questions, sort of questions for meaningful academic inquiry, I think a lot of them come out of my activism, or they come out of being fortunate enough to have my ear to the ground of other people's activism, right, and hearing about the kinds of things that people are confronting, in various kinds of movement work or in my own movement work. That is, by and large, actually it's where my whole research program is, because I ran into some anti-war activists in 2003, so yeah, very closely connected with trying to change the world for the better.
If I may just say quickly as we close, for me, it's a really simple set of questions and principles. The first thing that I would consider is what would be a natural starting point, and then ask myself, what happened before that, right? And so to start from that place, knowing that in any course I teach, I want you to understand the history, but not for the sake of understanding the history. The goal of anything I'm teaching is when you pick up your newspaper today and you see that people from the Tigrayan region of Ethiopia are going into Sudan, I want you to understand what the British did in Sudan, what the Italians did in Eritrea, what the Italians tried to do in Ethiopia, and how all of these concentric circles of history and how they have been viewed impact what is happening to real people in the real world right now.
I'll add to this quickly in terms of how my research is connected to these conversations. One of the biggest blessings that I've had is engaging with African feminists, Afro-feminists, and Black feminist thought in understanding the coloniality of gender, understanding the ways in which gender relations were in other places in Africa and in the Americas before the colonial encounter. And the result of, again, this erasure of history of Black women in the in anti-colonial movements and in the emergence of the African state, the role of Black women in Black power resistance in America or in the Caribbean. And so for me, part of my work, part of my research is really pushing against the white supremacist patriarchy, because they are interlinked. The ways in which we understand sex and power, gendered power today around the world has very much been influenced by the way in which Europe understood gender relation and how it exported these relations elsewhere. So part of my scholarship, my research on women in armed groups, my research on women in politics, and my unearthing of Black women's contributions around the world has really been to decenter patriarchy, but also decenter white supremacy and how to understand the worth and the value of Black women globally. And how I do that through collaborations. And sometimes I have to let the people who I work with dictate the type of questions I should be asking, because we're co-producing knowledge. And I think the decolonial approach to international relations and international affairs goes back to what Vanessa was speaking at the beginning. Have you asked people you're doing your research or interventions on what exactly it is that is worth knowing or understanding? Once you open that dialogue in terms of ethics of research, you take a completely different trajectory than if you're simply doing, I know best what should be understood and what should be investigated.
Thank you so much, professors. We're out of time here, so I'm gonna turn it over to Maya to close us out for the evening.
Hello, everyone. I don't think I speak for myself alone when I say that this conversation tonight was extremely fruitful. I would like to personally thank our 4 panelists for offering your time, your knowledge, and your research, as well as your scholarship with us tonight. I know I will personally be walking away with a lot to ponder with, a lot to think about, a lot of book recommendations. I'm very excited to start reading those as well. And I would also like to personally thank our co-sponsors and other departments within the GW network for helping us execute our event tonight. I know just a couple minutes ago, Elia, she did drop, our secretary, a few links and resources. Elia, if you could drop those again really quickly for everyone who did not see the message previously. It's going to be our website, our LinkedIn, our YouTube, which this recording for tonight's event will be posted, as well as some initiatives and programs that we're currently working on executing as an organization. And then I think I said our LinkedIn, yes, okay. And then once again, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists and our co-sponsors for tonight. Thank you to our audience for your engagement and for your attendance. Happy Black History Month, and please enjoy your evening. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
And nice meeting you all.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Good night. I really appreciate the conversation. Good night.
It's an honor having each of you on our panel tonight.
Yay.
Don't stop.
Yes, don't stop. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.